to the Society of Professional Journalism podcast here at Loyola Marymount University. Today we have a very special episode, a very special guest. We have Miss Yolie Flores. For people who may not know who Yolie Flores is, obviously I know who you are. Obviously so many people in Los Angeles know who you are. And around the world for that matter, definitely in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about, where you grew up and, maybe where you got your degrees?
Yeah. So I grew up, the initial 5 years of my life, I grew up in the El Paso, Juarez, Las Cruces, New Mexico area. My family had immigrated from northern Mexico into that region. And so I was born in El Paso and spent the first 5 years of my life there. And then my family moved to South LA. And mostly have lived in the LA area since that time. So I've gone to schools in some part of the county. Elementary school was in Norwalk, and then my family moved to Huntington Park. And so my middle school and my high school years were in Huntington Park. So I graduated from Huntington Park High School. I was the first in my family to graduate from high school and then go on to college. And college was at the University of Redlands. Did my 4 years bachelor's degree in communicative disorders. I thought I might be a speech therapist. And then I took a couple of years off. I lived in Spain for a year and then explored. When I returned, I explored the field of speech pathology, speech therapy, to really make sure that that was the direction that I still wanted to go in. And it turns out it wasn't. I explored other professions at the time, wasn't quite sure. And I stumbled upon the UCLA School of Social Work master's program and learned about it a little bit and very quickly knew that that was my path. That really what I had been looking for in my life, for how I wanted to spend my life, the work that I wanted to do, just aligned so perfectly with being a social worker. And what aligned so well was just my values of helping people achieve their aspirations, removing barriers to success, rethinking the systems that keep people down in this country, especially if you are like me, a child of immigrant family, an English learner, growing up in a low-income community. It just felt right that I would choose a path that could open up opportunities for so many people in the way that so many in my family did not have, and that I could finally chart for myself. So I applied to the UCLA School of Social Welfare program and completed my master's there. So that's my education.
I find it really fascinating and admirable and a lot of different things that you would, I can tell you're an idealist from the way that you decided to follow something that felt central to your identity. You mentioned that you're the first of your family to complete high school and college. Was that a motivating factor later on, or was that something that came full circle that, when you found that program, you said, that kind of seems like, something that was sort of rooted in my own experiences for me to go change some kind of like you've already changed the dynamic in your family, your history, your lineage, but then to go on and to be able to help other people do that, was that sort of like part of the conversation internally that you had with yourself when you were applying?
I think it was what I saw and experienced from my parents, and the messages that I would get from them about why we're on this earth, that we are here to help other people and to be in service and of service to others. I remember growing up and also seeing a lot of people help my family, whether it was other family members or people that they knew, sort of being either new as immigrants to this country or new in LA. And I also grew up experiencing personally the value of helping others. I have a long history since my childhood of needing medical care and being involved in the healthcare system, and experiencing how doctors and nurses, in this case the medical field, the role that they played in my life and in my family. So it feels to me, it has always felt to me that that's my purpose, that's the role that not only I have chosen to play in my life, but that feels natural and aligned, and that brings me a sense of fulfillment and of purpose and value, right? The value of having an opportunity to be alive, be next to you, is by being in service to you or to others.
Yeah.
And for a while, I wasn't quite clear when I was in graduate school. I wasn't quite clear whether I wanted to be in service of the elderly, veterans. So I was exploring a bit, but I've always been drawn to children. I've always been drawn to families. And so every step of the way, both in my graduate program, but before and after, that's felt the most natural to me, is to make a difference in the lives of children and families. And that has been my career path.
That's a word that's been on my mind lately a lot, is serve. And to be, what does it mean to be a servant? So when you took that next step and completed this program, I mean, social work and social welfare is just kind of like this podcast I was telling you. It's a very broad world to step into, right? You know you want to help, but I mean, you begin to look at the world in those terms, and there are so many people in need, right? So how did you even to decide, I want to help grade schoolers, I want to help youngsters, I want to help pre-K, I want to help high schoolers, how do you even begin to sort of walk that path, and what did that look like?
Sometimes you don't know, but you stumble on opportunity, and then you figure out whether that opportunity feels like it's taking you to the next opportunity, because it's what you are drawn to and what you what feels aligned to your purpose. And so that's really what happened. I took a course it was my first year in graduate school, that led me to work with a group of students on a concept. We were going to develop a concept related to sort of a change effort that would significantly improve the lives of a particular population. And we chose the idea of creating a workplace that offered working families employer-supported childcare. And I had never thought about that idea. And so it was really in writing that paper and working with my other colleagues that it just started to inform me and what might be sort of the thing that really could fulfill me. And so I did that, and I found it super interesting. And so in my second year...
So for people who don't know what this is that you're referring to, so you helped to foster the creation of, which didn't exist at the time.
It's just a paper.
It was like a maternity sort of care, paid leave sort of thing. It wasn't a paradigm, right, at the time?
No, employer-supported childcare is the term, sort of what it was called. And this was in the late 80s. And it wasn't all that common. It was sort of a new way of thinking about the role of employers from really an employer point of view, right? Increasing productivity, decreasing absenteeism, increasing morale. So it was really around what makes for a good workforce so that your business thrives. But the way I saw it, and this is how we thought about it in the paper that we wrote, the way I saw it was a win-win. That if we could have employers for their bottom line also meet the needs of people, how powerful might that be? So it opened up some ideas and some interest on my end. And so by the time I was looking for my second field placement in my second year, I thought about where could I do that in real life? Because again, it was just a paper. But where might I be able to actually do that kind of work? And started to explore with my field advisor. And long story short, we found out that the LA Department of Water and Power was looking for an intern that could help develop their work and family program. So it just like the stars aligned. Somehow I bumped up against this opportunity. And that's where I began my career. So I did it first as an intern my second year. And then when I graduated from UCLA with my master's degree, I became the director of what we call DWP Family Care, and spent the first 5 years of my career creating all kinds of ways that DWP as an employer could support working families, again, meeting the needs of the business, right? All the things we talked about, productivity, morale, decreasing absenteeism and tardiness and all of that. But the impact that could have on the workers, but more importantly for me, because this is where I really am passionate and aligned, is what the impact would be on children. And in a society where most parents work, we know that it's a huge challenge, and the impact is always on that child, right? Because they have two working parents, how might then we meet the needs for these children? So that was my interest. And in that job, I really learned a lot about the important first 5 years of life. And I had the opportunity to attend a lot of conferences and talk to leaders across the country. So while I was in that role, I was learning more and more the power of the early years in young children to thrive later in that period of time, but also later in life. And that sort of began to chart the rest of my career. So everything I have done since then has in one way or another been informed by what I know about the early years, what I know about the role of parents and caregivers, and what I know about early childhood and K-12 education. And fast forward 30 years, everything now connects. And I have now the opportunity to bring into the work that I'm doing all of these different pieces in a coherent way to make sure that, again, kids that look like me have an opportunity to succeed in this country.
So what specifically did you learn about, you mentioned those first 5 years and how critical it is. I would imagine there was some biological aspects of what you learned. Like you learned about the actual development of a child, and the neurology and the physical development and how that relates to the environment. Then I would imagine you also learned some sociological aspects, statistics about these kids versus these kids who get exposed to better teachers, better education, maybe they're higher income families where the mother can have, maternal leave without really worrying about it, versus low income families which is kind of what the program was geared toward that you created at the Department of Water and Power, right? Which is to give mothers that sort of paid time off. It was an empathetic approach to mothers in the workplace that was really for the children, right? So can you talk to me a little bit more about what you did learn about those first 5 years of life that really went on to change and chart the course for your
Sure,
career?
yeah. I mean, it was all of that. But before I even answer that question, let me just, it's important for anyone listening to this podcast to know that when we talk about the caregiver, it's not just the mother, it's the mother and the father. In fact, the majority of the employees at the Department of Water and Power are men. 80%. Because it's a blue collar industry, right? Mostly the employees that are out digging ditches, climbing electrical poles. And so it occurred to me early on that I didn't want for DWP Family Care to be just for the mother, just for the women, because then we would be missing the majority of our workforce. And I also know how powerful it was that my father was so involved in my upbringing and my well-being. And the research was very clear that the role of fathers is critical. So for both, we were trying to address the needs of moms and dads in the workforce, which, yes, included on-site childcare, off-site childcare. There was a new federal law, FPLM. So it was essentially a paid family leave program, but it was unpaid. But at least parents, if they wanted to, now had legally the right to take time off to care for their children if they wanted to after maternity leave or paternity leave. We had a breastfeeding program for the mother, actually, and also for the father.
Can you talk to us about that? Because I remember you mentioning that to me.
Yes.
Just briefly.
Unfortunately, this still happens today, where women who come back from giving birth, after they come back from maternity leave and they want to continue breastfeeding, if they're working, they'll need to pump, right? And so we had this program where, especially if you worked out in the field, if you were a field employee, you can check out what's called a Medela pump. Medela is the company. But when you're when you were in the office, generally women have a pump that they bring with them, and they have to find a place to go and pump. So many of them will go hide in the bathroom or go to their car. But what we did at the Department of Water and Power is we actually created a space for women to, when they needed to take a 15-minute break, and go into this beautiful room that we created with a rocking chair, with nice soft music, so that women would be comfortable in pumping, so that they could take the milk home to their child. For the men, and this actually became the most interesting thing that happened as we were thinking about how do we create all of what we're doing here also for men. The employees, the male employees, started to ask about the pumps that we would make available to the women to take out in the field, and wondered if they could check out a pump, sort of like a lending library that we developed, for their spouse, because their spouse's employer didn't provide anything like this. So the majority of the people actually that borrowed the pumps through our lending library of Medela pumps were men. We later then developed what we called Birth Alert. So this is going to date me. This is at a time when we had pagers, so those don't exist anymore.
Right.
But even when pagers did exist, it was usually lawyers and doctors, right, that had a pager. And I remember that I had a former supervisor who was an executive director of another nonprofit who was carrying a pager, and I asked him, he was my first year as a student, my first year internship. So I asked him why he was carrying a pager. And he said because his wife was pregnant, and he wanted to make sure that when she went into labor that he could be contacted, because he was like always running around, that we didn't have cell phones at the time.
Right.
So as I thought about how else we could support working fathers at DWP, I remembered this story of the pager. And so I went to my boss, who was the head of human resources, and I said, what if in our lending library we also could check the employees that work for the male employees, if their spouses or partners were in the last trimester of their pregnancy, that they could check out a pager. Because imagine if you're an expectant father, no cell phones exist, you're out in the field, digging a ditch, climbing an electric pole, how would you know that your partner was going into labor so that you could be with her?
Oh yeah, I need to know, right?
Right?
I gotta find out.
So we created this lending library, and we would have men lined up. And yeah, I mean, it was a cool thing to have a pager, but they were like really wanting to have that support, that support for them,
Right.
so that they could be there for the birth of their child. So in many ways, we were sending messages by the things we were doing to our male employees, that being a father mattered, and that we were going to support you in the workplace to be the best father that you could be for your child. So we also had like parenting workshops during lunch, number of other supports, a lending library, parenting library. And it was a very comprehensive, and we were a pioneer in the country at that time for what's called employer-supported childcare. But yeah, so I learned a lot about, the various milestones, important child development milestones that children need to achieve. But also learned, because I was paying a lot of attention to data. You were talking about that earlier.
Yeah.
And the data was showing me that the majority of children who were missing their milestones, or not achieving language development, cognitive development, all of that, not having what they needed to be ready for school or to succeed in school when they started school, and then looking at the data of school success, it was very evident that if you were low income and a family of color, your children would be less likely to be on the path to success. So that just, sort of led me to focus much more on broader policy issues that could change the dynamics of what was happening to children and families in this country, not by one program at a time, but by policies at a national level and a state level around early childhood, around supports for parents, around K-12 education, because that's the pathway to success.
So that's a big jump from the Department of Water and Power. There was so much that happened in between. If you look at, anybody who can look at your career or even your LinkedIn, right, can see this just extensive history of you creating, overseeing, doing project management for these initiatives, these nonprofits, different, city boards, and it's actually unbelievable to me. And so I sort of, you jumped straight to how you were creating policies, but most people, who might know that that you ran for Congress, and so that was a big goal, was to create that momentum for you to be able to implement change at not that you don't create change or have created change at a national level, right? But to take that next step. So if you could talk about that process maybe a little bit, and sort of what led you to that point. And then I want to also talk about I want to talk about Parent Nation. I want to talk about different things like that.
Right. So even before I ran for Congress, I had run for school board. And that was at a time where I was paying even much more greater attention to the K-12 system in LA. And by then, this is where my career has always been focused in LA.
Right.
And it occurred to me as I was really learning a lot. I had been appointed to the LA County Board of Education. And it was then that I started to really pay attention to educational outcomes in the K-12 system, because prior to that, as I said, I was really focused on the 0 to 5 early childhood years. And just two things that were annoying me. One was that there were so few people on the Board of Education, few people of color, and yet the majority of the students are kids of color. And it just didn't sit well with me that we did not have that kind of representation who really understood the needs of the population that it served, or couldn't relate. I didn't see the board responding and reacting to the needs of community in the way that I thought communities deserved, families deserved. The second thing was that we had an incredible dropout rate. And I'm looking again at the data. And so many huge educational disparities or issues related to educational disparities. And I was like, why isn't anybody screaming about this? Why aren't we outraged in this city that our kids are not succeeding, that we are failing our children? And so I decided I was gonna find people to run for the school board. People of color, people who could understand our communities. And I failed miserably. I couldn't find anybody to say, yes, I will run. And then my colleagues said, you need to look in the mirror. Why aren't you running for school board? So I sort of reluctantly said, yeah, okay, you're right. And I didn't know anything about politics. I'd never run for anything. I didn't know anybody in my family who had been a politician. But I did care deeply about this. And I thought, okay, you need to put your money where your mouth is. If you care about this, then you do something about this. So I ran for school board. I lost that campaign by, I don't know, about 500 votes. It was pretty close.
Wow.
And that led me to, the next thing. And then I became the executive director of the LA County Children's Planning Council. I ran that public-private entity for 8 years and had the opportunity to do a lot more work around vulnerable children and families from a systems level and a policy level.
Right. You had a massive budget for that too, and a large team. It was almost 50 people, right?
So, and 50, and it didn't start out that way. I built it over time, and we did a lot of work to really bring community voice to the work of systems change in LA County. And that's how I was able to grow my staff, because we had staff representing communities in each of what are called the service planning areas in LA County.
And there was councils created, right?
Yes, and we created these community councils, so they were called SPA councils, not spa like where you go get a massage, but service planning area councils.
Right.
So that we could bring the voice of community to the changes that we needed to see in county government for vulnerable kids and families, like child welfare, juvenile justice, which we call probation here, public social services, mental health. And that was a lot of learning on my part on the systems that affect children, and really worked to address some of those and to track the data. Again, I've always been very data driven. So it was after that the opportunity to run for school board again came up, and this time the Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, tapped me and encouraged me to run again, and eventually I decided that I would. And this time I won, so I'd had now a little bit of experience from the first time running for office and running a campaign and all of that. But I also had much more support. I had by now name recognition. So I won, and I sat on the school board for 4 years. And it was probably the most difficult job that I've ever had because it's very political.
Very involved.
But it was also the most important work I have done. And I was able to test myself whether I had the courage to really try to create big change for children in LA. And
you had to make some tough decisions.
I made some really difficult decisions, always with the interest of what is right for children, especially children who have been neglected and who we have failed time and time again.
To see. Can you talk about any of those decisions?
And so, I could talk about some of those. But I really, I needed to step into my leadership. I needed to not be afraid to take on issues that were controversial, but also consequential. So some are very evidently very controversial, like the policy that I authored called public school choice. And then there were things that I didn't think were controversial that still became controversial, but that's just sort of politics in the whole LA school system. But with public school choice, and that's what I mostly am known for still, for good or for not good, people will love me or hate me depending on where you sit on that piece of work. But public school choice attempted to do a couple things. One was that I was trying to find every other way as a school board member to get the needs of minority children, low-income children, kids of color met. And I just kept coming in across roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. Why you couldn't do this differently for these children, whether it was, okay, I'll give you an example. even then I was already concerned about how many kids were not reading proficiently by the end of third grade, which is a critical milestone.
Yeah, there's like insane statistics on
Yes, we're going to talk about that.
literacy and
Yes.
and
There
being
are
a functional member
huge
of society.
consequences if you can't. It's game over, Sam. If
think
you
it's something
can't
like-
read, it's practically game over.
It's like 70% of all incarcerated individuals cannot read at a fourth grade level. So
That's right.
So it's really like that. There's a time gap there, right? The data shows something like that, right?
It's overwhelmingly the vast majority do not have good literacy, cannot read.
If you can't do basic,
Right.
intellectual work, you have
So
to
I started to ask, why can't we identify the best teachers that know how to teach reading to our children and put those teachers into kindergarten, first, second? And no, can't do that because of union contracts, because of teacher seniority, other policies that just consistently would get in the way of doing what I thought was the right thing for children. So, so I was trying to find all the right ways, right meaning that everybody could buy into it. That wasn't going to happen.
You can't please everybody. Yeah.
And there was no urgency. There was no sense of urgency in this huge system about the fact that we were failing children decade after decade after decade. Like for me, the house was on fire and nobody's like yelling fire.
Nobody even cares that
Right?
it's burning.
I was
Yeah.
like, so the opportunity came up, and this is really from listening to a lot of families, actually seeing a lot of families cry about the fact that their kids are failing and nobody's doing anything about it. And not knowing what to do, not knowing who to go to. Cities that would say to me, city mayors, because LA Unified covers other cities, not just the city of LA, including the city I grew up in, Huntington Park. So, this idea of public school choice came from having tried everything else, talking to a lot of parents, talking to a lot of leaders, city mayors, who actually wanted to take a whole region and go charter. And I was like, you don't want to do that. This was also at a time where we were building a whole bunch of new schools to get out of overcrowding and the consent decree that we had, because kids were in overcrowded
Why
conditions.
wouldn't you want to go charter?
Let's come back to the whole charter thing in just a minute.
Okay.
Because that's a really good question. So I introduced a resolution, it's a policy, that said for any of the remaining schools that still need to be built, there were around 50,
It's a lot.
why don't we create a process where we open up who would run those schools, and that we could actually base our decision on quality and commitment to getting kids what they need, as opposed to the same old way of starting a new school, even with the high, we had already built, I think, close to 100 schools, and there were 50 more to build. And many of those schools, their kids were already failing again, even with the state-of-the-art construction and no more overcrowding. So,
Was it the way that the county was appointing, or the school board was appointing these individuals? Like, what was so messed
because
up
we
about
were
it?
not appointing anybody. It was just the same people running the schools the same way, regardless if it was a brand new school or not. My proposal was, let's not do that anymore. It's not working. It's not working for our children. Why don't we instead invite people to submit a proposal? You could be a university. You could be the teachers union.
Okay.
You could be a charter school. You could be a traditional LA Unified run school. But have people apply to talk about their ideas for how this school is going to achieve what our kids deserve in terms of student outcomes. So that's why it was called public school choice.
So a university could apply to...
Anybody who was a nonprofit could apply to run our schools.
Interesting. And employ the teachers?
They could. They wanted to.
And so it was...
Well, we'd still have to employ teachers. It was the how.
Right.
So if you're a charter, and this was the rub, if you're a charter school, you're not in the regular teachers union, although some charter schools are still unionized.
It's more like private, kind of.
It's run differently. I wanted results for kids. I don't care. In fact, I didn't care if you were public or private. I want results for kids. But in this space, we were committed to public education.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that public education could do better. We don't have to privatize. I wasn't interested in that direction. And so we created this process where you could apply to run these new schools. And that created a lot of controversy, particularly from those that are anti-charter because they're not part of the teachers union. But I got the votes almost unanimously. The entire board, I think there was one no, voted to approve this whole process. The superintendent at the time actually expanded my proposal and said, why just the new schools? What if we also invite people to run the most failing schools? I'm like, great, add them to the list.
To kind of shake things up, almost
Yes.
like a private equity of public education.
And to me, I was like, maybe this will shake up the system. Because we were in a status quo, like I said
You couldn't
earlier,
shake
like
anything up.
nobody really cared.
Right.
Everybody still came to work the next year,
Producing the same results.
producing the same results. You would still have a job, but our
Yeah.
kids were not succeeding.
There's no results. Yeah.
So
I like that. You have to do something different.
So that was, and then I also, actually one of the proposals that I'm most proud of is one that's called Parents as Equal Partners in the Education of Your Children, which kind of leads to Parent Nation, which you wanted to ask me about.
Right.
But the idea here is that we would begin to change how we interacted with parents as, the caregivers of the students, of the children that we serve. My observation was that most parents were not very welcomed in their children's schools.
Interesting.
Their opinions were not welcomed. There were barriers to participating. There was, in my view, this love-hate relationship with parents.
Do you think it was because of the communities that these certain schools were in, or was it just LA as a whole?
This is not just LA, and it's not because people don't care. What I've come to believe, and I truly do believe this, is that school systems have never really, whether you're a teacher prep program at a university or wanting to become a superintendent, that has never been a focus of your preparation, how to engage families. So most people don't know. They don't
Right.
have
Like, that's not my job
the
description.
awareness. It's just not an awareness that, we should be doing something differently in terms of our relationship between schools and home.
It should be a dialogue.
Right. It's all about relationships, about trust. And we've just not trained anybody in the education space to understand that. We're doing that now in my current job, actually. Mm-hmm. But there's now this whole movement in the country around family engagement in schools. Mm. But at the time, we were still way behind. And so I introduced a resolution called Parents as Equal Partners in the Education of Their Children. That led to every single school having a parent center. And that parent center being staffed where parents could really come and be engaged and learn about their children's school, how to help them at home. So, and that still exists today. And
Is that all of LA County? Is that
LA Unified.
LA Unified School District?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But that's, that piece about parents for me has always been the thread, whether it was at DWP. Right? We didn't talk about this at my work at the Children's Planning Council, but that, and then in this case, also just lifting up the role that parents play in the lives of their children. Parents have the most play the most critical, impactful role in a child's life. If you think about your family, your parents, yes, of course, teachers, principals, counselors, but who shapes you and has the potential to advocate for you is your parent. So for me, elevating the role of parents has always been an essential part of my commitment for children to fulfill their aspirations and reach their full potential.
So the K through 12 public school system in LA, what it needs, like you assessed sort of like the current health of it from your perspective, and then said, what can we do to make this a more holistic environment where parents have access to, which they sort of already should have access to their kids, right? There's obviously a fine line between, you know, like your kids go to school and then there's a certain level of trust, like, you know, I have to trust to a certain extent the school I'm sending my kid to, and that they'll be receiving a good education, because and you have to care first off, right, too, so you have to know how important education is. But a lot of the time in a low income place like that, it's like education may have never been the forefront. You may have had a blue collar family growing up, and that might not have been a focal point, right?
No, my dad had a 3rd grade education. My mom had a 6th grade education.
So then
But they cared deeply because they knew that the only way out of poverty was for me to get an education. So this is a myth that we've always tried to dispel, that low-income that's not what you were saying, but it's out there, that low-income parents of color don't care, and that's just not true.
Right.
Even if they didn't have a good education themselves, they want their children to succeed.
Yeah.
And we ought to be leveraging that love and care and concern that parents have for their children instead of turning parents away, which is typically what we do in schools.
It might be what we do. But then, you know, and then there's also that certain level of intervention, right, that you say has to happen with the child as well. It can't all just be, because the child is the one doing the work, right? So they have to be motivated, they have to be in a healthy mental space.
Absolutely.
They have to, maybe school could be, you know, is their safe place, or, you know, because if the second they feel like school is a place where they can't thrive and they can't succeed, it's like
they check out.
Yeah, you begin to lose them, and that can become a cycle that gets out of, and especially if the school is an unhealthy environment, right? So it's all about keeping the school environment and the culture really healthy and
important,
nurturing, and
super important,
because you see these things about, you know, communities of color, and the school to jail pipeline is a big term that's coming. It's just getting larger and larger, kind of in the cultural atmosphere that I keep hearing about, and the statistics and the numbers on it is completely undeniable, and just the way that some schools have police in them that can give actual offenses that go on records, disciplinary records.
Schools can, and many have, become part of that school to prison pipeline. There have been a lot of efforts to change that and to, you know, help schools think about restorative justice as opposed to the criminal justice frame. One of my early experiences, which gets into the issue of reading, in my first year on the school board, was I had a community organizer from Highland Park, where I live, who called me, and I had met him through my campaign, and he's like, Yolie, would you be willing to meet with these 10 kids? They're all from Highland Park. They're all would have been in 7th grade. They've all dropped out. I'm like, 7th graders?
Is that legal? Can a kid drop out of school? And so he doesn't. They don't have rights like that, do they yet? Do they? Does a kid have a right to drop out of school? I feel like
you
that's
just
illegal,
do.
right?
Whether you mentally drop out or you physically,
or you just stop showing up.
Right, you just don't show up.
Right.
So I said yes, of course. I want to talk to these guys. So we meet at some coffee shop, I think. And it was so sobering. I said to them, why? You guys are only in 7th grade. What happened? Why did you drop out? They said to me, Miss, do you know what it feels like when you can't read? When you're relegated to the back of the room, or your teacher just doesn't even pay attention to you anymore, or you feel shame. Do you know what that's like? I said, I do not know what that's like. They're like, well, if you did, you would drop out too. It was very sobering. So the school to prison pipeline looks a lot of different ways. That's part of it. You can't read. You don't want to be in school. Because after 3rd grade, which is around the time that we expect kids to now have the basics of reading, because everything after that, you are reading to learn. Mm-hmm. You're reading everything to learn history.
That's how you progress.
To, learn anything. We live in a text-based society. So that was also part of why I introduced public school choice. Because I could feel the urgency of it. And I wanted other people to feel the urgency. We felt urgency on a bunch of other adult issues, like when our payroll system went haywire at LA Unified my first year, and teachers were not getting paid or getting underpaid or overpaid. It was a big fiasco. And in that time, all of the adults organized night and day, 24/7 to solve the problem of the payroll crisis that had happened. And once we resolved it, I remember asking the superintendent and the other school board members, I'm like, what if we all acted like that when we saw the dropout rates? Where we would not stop, we would be relentless until we solved the problem. But we're not doing that for children.
Right. Yeah, for people who really haven't heard that term, it says, so the school to jail pipeline is the intersection of the K through 12 public education system and law enforcement, and the trend of referring students directly to law enforcement for committing offenses at school or creating conditions that increase the probability of students eventually becoming incarcerated, such as suspending or expelling them. And there's all this data, an endless amount of data, believe me, and I can cite my sources, a bunch of sources that I've found for different organizations and university studies about how students of color are twice as likely to be punished when they engage in the same behavior. Black and brown students are more than twice as likely than white students to be referred or arrested to law enforcement in school, like at school. I think
right,
it's
the same behavior that other kids get a pass on.
No, it's essentially just two different people doing the same thing, and it's a different outcome.
Yeah. By the way, that happens out of school too. Happens in child welfare. It happens in policing in neighborhoods.
which is
You're black and brown, you get different treatment.
Yeah. I mean, and I feel like it's imperative. I don't know, for me to share it personally. I mean, you would see cops coming to school sometimes, right? It was very rare, and personally, I mean, I never knew anybody that was, maybe it was my community. It's just having police in school. It just feels, I don't know, the idea of that to me sounds like it would create an environment that is tense and really just not conducive the piece that it takes to get involved in your studies, to really immerse yourself in something and get imaginative versus kind of be stuck in your physical body because you have so much stuff going on.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, there's a lot of good work happening to rethink policing in schools. One, I mean, you're right. I wish we never had to have that. But there are some schools that are really using their school police force as counselors, as coaches and mentors to kids, while making sure that everybody's safe. You know, given the gun violence in this country, I can see why there are families that do want to have security on campus.
Right. Some places.
But how might we, sort of meet both objectives, keeping schools safe so that kids are safe, but not interacting with kids in the way that we have in the past.
Right.
That create that school to prison pipeline that you talk about.
Yeah, I would imagine it makes some kids feel safer. Depending on the area you're from. Yeah, just keeping that internal harmony so that it feels like once you're inside this school, the way it feels at a university, when you step into a university, there's kind of that piece of like, I might even be, I mean, USC is in Watts. It's like, but when you step onto USC's campus, you're like, I'm safe, You don't really have to think twice about it, There's that kind of that sense of calm.
Well, we want for kids to feel safe. Otherwise, they're not in a mode of learning.
Which which brings up the fact that USC is a reputationally wealthy school, and it seems to also be due a lot to funding, right? It's interesting that there's like the disparity there as well. You would think that it would cost more to have like a security force on campus, but it says, it all stems back to Brown versus the Board of Education, right? And different things like that, segregation in schools. It says non-white school districts receive $23 billion less than white school districts, despite serving the same number of students. This is something that, like, the policy behind this and the history behind this, I'm still not as attuned as I'd like to be. This is just stuff that I was flipping through, right?
Yeah.
Finding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Over 50 years ago, we had Brown versus Board of Education that would, I think those were the dreams back then of that lawsuit. And that Supreme Court decision that this would bring equity and justice to schools where you had high numbers of kids of color, low-income families, and we're still, in many ways, in the same place.
So you worked for the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
I was a Annie E. Casey fellow.
Okay.
And then I spent a year and a half doing a consulting project for them.
Okay. Yeah, I was reading one of their studies talking about, the relationship between literacy in prison and parental incarceration in prison, and talking about how, more than 5 million children, or 1 in 14 minors under the age of 18, have had a parent incarcerated or in prison at some point in their lives. As for the race and gender of parents in state prison, you have 3 and 5 white and Hispanic, respectively. So, were mothers of minors. So 3 and 5 women, right? And so you talk about like parenthood and how that's so important, and how, right, sometimes there's a kid's not always going to get to pick, right? Like kind of how they're growing up and the things that they can do, or they might even catch themselves in a situation where they are now trapped in it. They might have experienced some form of the penal system, whether it be some form of juvenile detention or an expulsion from school and they have to go to a different school district, or, you know, when you talk about like resources for people like that, and, you know, you talk about different things that, you know, maybe kids can do to get involved in that. I'm sure you have a network that touches on some form of that as far as social work goes. What would you kind of, because you mentioned you talked to those kids that dropped out of school, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, other than just talking to them, I'm sure you refer them to some place or some people, or, you know, there's more like, so what do you kind of say to a kid like that? Or, you know, what would you kind of like try and...
Yeah, there's a whole movement called the community schools movement now, which is really exciting because it is building supports around kids that fill in the gaps for other needs that they might have, so that, you know, when they are in school, they're fully present. But so many kids are struggling with a lot of different issues, many of them related to living in conditions of poverty. But this whole movement around community schools is really around making sure that those kids have all the wraparound services that they need, or their families. But also that there's mentoring and coaching and, you know, that kind of a caring adult relationship that especially young people need in order to believe in themselves, you know, and to know that they have support to thrive and to keep going. So that's, you know, California actually has just put in billions of dollars into community schools to provide those kinds of supports for young people.
Well, and you mentioned that a lot of it, you know, too, is that it is the poverty, right? It's like when money isn't a factor, right? Because I've had friends, right, where it's you know, well, my parents aren't paying for me to go to college, so I'm not gonna go, right? I mean, I could name a few growing up off the top of my head, and it's just, you know, I feel like it takes a certain amount of education to even know that there's a fiscally responsible and stable and affordable way through the education system. That if you do dedicate yourself to your studies, there is a light at the end of that tunnel that will bear fruit. You don't have to cash out early. There's ways to defer that process until you can have a degree, or at least some form of to be a more qualified, competitive individual in the workplace, and you can show yourself what you can do. More importantly, right? You know, I'm still trying to look for an answer to that question, like how to even get people to start understanding that, you know, all you see now is like articles published about how the price of college is rising and how, you know,
it's out of reach.
How expensive an education is these
out of
days.
Reach for most families, even middle class families, it's out of reach.
There's a rhetoric about how, you know, college isn't worth the money anymore. It's like an undergraduate degree isn't even gonna do this or that, right? It's like there's this strange, like, sort of rhetoric about a college education now that I feel it's like so false.
Well, the important thing is that we prepare kids to give them choices and options to be able to afford those choices, whether it's scholarships or other supports. And, you know, at minimum, that's how we should be thinking about education, is can we guarantee, one, that children can read, but that they're going to be set up to make the best choices for them, whether it's college or career or the service, whatever, you know, rather than assuming that those kids don't need to be prepared for college because they couldn't afford it anyway, or they don't have the intellectual capacity to, which are all of the mindsets that we've had in the past.
Right, it's such a mindset.
But can we create the conditions in schools, which is the work that we're doing now at Families in Schools, by supporting families, equipping them, informing them, giving them knowledge so that they know every step of the way how to guide their children, because oftentimes the school system doesn't tell them.
Yeah.
To get them on the path toward either college or career, including how to apply for financial aid, including how to get financial support, etc. So at Families in Schools, we're doing that with families, but we're also building the capacity of the school leaders, the school system, to better engage with those families. It's going back to what we were talking about, family engagement.
Right, to raise men and women.
And thinking about family engagement earlier, starting in the 0 to 5 years, again, bringing everything that I know all to make sense of how we really need to support families from the very beginning, the 0 to 5 years. That's when brain development is happening, right? A child's brain, 90% of a child's brain is finally formed by the age of 5. And if in those years we didn't provide families the supports that they needed, we miss building that child's capacity to learn. But we also want to anchor our work around family engagement to some critical milestones, like reading at grade level.
Yeah.
But it's a continuum. It starts at birth, and it's everything we do all along the way to make sure that child is achieving, to make sure that family has the knowledge and awareness and information to help their child succeed, and then making sure that the educators have that mindset shift to really engage students in a way that they believe in themselves, that they feel that people care about them, but also that they're engaging families to do the same thing.
Yeah. I think it just strikes me as something it's so mindset based, like what you're talking, what you said, that it's to get a child to the point where they believe in themselves, they're motivated, they can be self-motivated, and they know that they can go succeed, and they can get competitive, and they can really start to drive themselves, and it doesn't have to be this thing where insecurity is part of their self-talk or their internal dialogue, and it can be something where even knowing that's a part of growing up and pushing through that and persevering through that and showing yourself what you can do. To me, it's really, as I started to look more and more into kind of what every single thing in your LinkedIn, like what these companies, these nonprofits, organizations, movements, initiatives have been trying to do is to really encourage that, like the development of well-rounded people, and
well, at the end of the day, it matters because we want to live in a country, right, where as a nation we are thriving economically, that we have a civil society, that we have a democratic society. And that doesn't happen unless you prepare the very people who are going to be part of this nation to thrive. So it's in everybody's best interest for us to help every child, every parent first, because it's the parent that drives the well-being of that child, to have what they need to support their children, but then also that we're creating the conditions in early childhood, in K-12 education, in colleges, for every single child to succeed.
Ms. Flores, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you. Love talking about these issues. Thanks for all the great questions.
Of course.
It's been a joy to talk to you, Sam.
Of course, no problem. Thank you for watching the SPJ LMU podcast. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and tune in next time. Thank you.